Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we're jumping yet again over to a couple of Belgian-style ales. It's been a few weeks since I've done one of these. I always love trying new ones I've never had. Both of these are by brewers that I've had beers from prior that I like very well, but both of these are new beers to me. Once again, I have gotten both beers from Tavour. We're going to be starting with Anchorage Brewing Company. This is called The Turning Shape. It is a Belgian-style triple, clocks in at 8.5% ABV. Then for the second beer, we're going to kick it up a notch. This is Brewery Vivant's Wizard Burial Ground. It is a bourbon barrel-aged Belgian-style quad, 10% ABV on this one. Brewery Vivant is based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So we've got Anchorage Brewing Company. They're one of my favorite brewers that I've come to discover in the last year, thanks to Tavour. Everything I've had by them has been top notch. I've had a lot of IPAs. I had a barley one I really liked, but this will be the first Belgian triple I've had from them. So I'm very much looking forward to jumping into this and both of these indeed. So without further ado, we're going to jump right in, starting with Anchorage Brewing Company's The Turning Shape. This one clocks in at 8.5% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in with the first beer of today's Belgian-style beer review, we have got Anchorage Brewing Company's The Turning Shape. This is the Belgian-style triple that clocks in at 8.5% ABV. Of course, Anchorage Brewing Company is based in Anchorage, Alaska. So first things first, as always, they do have very neat label art on here. This one is kind of a wolf split with a human skull and almost looks like another animal skull on top that's been crossed by bows coming through either side of its head. So, maybe slightly unpleasant, but very, very cool label art. There's always are some of the best. So we're going to get this cracked and poured right in to our trusty goblet style glass, which tends to do a very good job for Belgian style beers. All right, let's get this one poured right in. All right. I can smell this as I'm pouring it. It's got a very pronounced aroma. I can tell you I smell a lot of very dough and bread-like qualities coming out of this glass, which really smells quite nice. It's not normally an aroma that I associate off the top of my head with a Belgian-style beer, but it smells quite nice. Typically, you're going to pick up notes, say cloves, or some kind of citrus, some kind of spices, even nutmeg and cinnamon kind of notes. This one, I'm very much smelling this absolutely delicious smelling malt bill. It smells very yeasty, very like yeast dough, like almost like you'd make a monkey bread or a pull-apart loaf. That yeasty type of baked good. It smells fantastic. Right up on it. Okay, I can still smell these very yeasty baked good aromas, but once you get right up on it, it does smell very much like a classic Belgian-style triple. I am indeed starting to pick up some of these citrus notes. There's a suggestion of cloviness, though. I don't actually expect it to smell like clove. In fact, there's a lot about this beer that smells a lot to me like a Hefeweizen, a German Hefeweizen, which, for my money, while they're distinctly different beer styles, they do share a lot of commonality, particularly in the aroma and the flavor profile. But the wonderful thing about both styles, and indeed Belgian beers in particular, is aside from being exceptionally complex, though they may smell very similar, you typically get something quite new and interesting in every one. So I'm going to top this off just a little bit more now that head is settled a bit. And we're going to jump right in. In terms of appearance, it's absolutely stunning. It's a very true bright yellow. Slight bit of occlusion, just a slight bit. Maybe some yeast particulates hanging out in there, but it looks great, looks the part, smells great. Let's jump right in. Yeah, there it is. Before I even swallowed, as I was agitating around the palate, I knew right away what I was going to get into when I swallowed. The aromas that come through very much translate into the flavor. And that's normally reasonably common with Belgian-style beers, but there's always these other interesting interplaying flavors that kind of move their way in and out. The first thing I got was indeed that classic Belgian-style ale clovey bite to it. And Belgian style beers in particular tend to have a much more pronounced layer of that flavor to them than, say, as I talked about earlier, a German Hefeweizen. Those do have an element of that, but they tend to be far more intense in that realm in a Belgian style ale. Indeed, so massive, massive notes of clove. I'm getting a lot of orange and I'm getting a lot of lemon. Some of it is juice-like, but there's a lot more of the zest that's coming through. There's a little element of the citrus oil side of that flavor profile that comes through as well, because it's got some underlying bitters to it. It's got this nice bite. In tandem with that, there's almost underlying notes of, say, star anise or cardamom or licorice, all three of which taste very similar. They're distinctly different, but they share a very common flavor and aroma that most people would just basically describe as licorice, what you would like black licorice candy, that kind of flavor, that kind of aroma. But they all have that aspect to them in varying degrees with some slight differences. That does come through as well. And that's not uncommon in a Belgian style, but I would say it's not one of the more common flavors. I've had it in some, but it is pretty unique. And that's just another nice, unique layer and flavor that's coming through in this beer. In tandem with that, exactly like I smelled, very big on the nose, there's a very big baked good and kind of yeasty backbone to this as well. And the dominant part of what's interplaying all these interesting flavors that make Belgian style beer so unique is indeed that Belgian style yeast. It's what's imparting all of these crazy aromas and all these crazy flavors into the beer. It's just a different strain. And in Belgium, they have some cultivated yeast, of course, and certainly the big brewers have cultivated their own strains, but they're typically from wild yeast. And you get a lot of interesting flavors and profiles that come out in a beer that way. And this is very well done. If you blindfolded me or didn't leave them labeled, had no sense of who was in the lineup, stuck this in a lineup with Belgian beers, 100% I would guess that this was legitimately a Belgian triple. Anyway, I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel, think of the flavor development, finish a bit more. The body on this one is a solid medium. It's about what I expect for a Belgian triple, but for the ABV range, compared to, say, other styles, say an 8.5% oatmeal stout or even an 8.5% IPA, the bodies on those beer styles are typically going to be a lot more robust. This feels exactly right to me. This feels just like a typical Belgian triple in this ABV range does. It's a solid medium, but it's not overly heavy and it's certainly not light. In terms of the mouthfeel, a similar story here. There's a little bit of resistance. Sure, it's got some fermentables in there, 8.5%, but it's not what you'd call a viscous beer style by any stretch of the imagination. By and large, it feels mostly flat until you start to move it around the palate and swallow. Then you can feel that resistance that it does have. So pretty much nailed exactly what I expected on the body and the mouthfeel front here. What else in terms of mouthfeel in particular? Agitating around the palate, this one does get quite creamy. It does thicken up even greater bit than what you just feel naturally as you're moving it around the palate. It's very, very nice. In terms of the finish, this one's got maybe on the high end of average in terms of length. It doesn't have quite the same length as some I've had. And really what's kind of pushing out the end of this one is a little combination of a couple factors. There's this intensity of that kind of baked goods side. It's really coming from the yeast. There's still this lingering kind of citrus zest and oil bittering effect that's hanging out on the back of the palate. And that's in tandem with just the slight underlying suggestion of licorice or star anise or cardamom that still hangs out on the back of the palate. So all in all, very much kind of a classic take on, just one of my favorite beer styles. I mean, they all seem to be my favorite, but I do love, one of the things I love the most about craft beer is just the infinite variety we have in styles. I mean, all beer is different. Sure, they share common elements and common buildups, but it's what goes into making these different styles independent. It makes one beer drinking experience completely different from the next. That's part of the fun of it. And honestly, for my money, nowhere else in the beer world is that more present than when we're talking about Belgian style beers. They're just some of the most interesting and unique You never really know what you're going to get. Sure, there's always common threads, and this has a lot of them, but you know, it's got its own little twists and turns, and it's really, really nice. I'm going to jump back in for final thoughts here. You're immediately hit up front with the intensity of that flavor. Really big, that nice clovey bite, the citrusy elements coming through, then those kind of licorice-like qualities coming through. And the intensity of that comes up front for the first few seconds. It starts to dial back a little bit. And then that very doughy, that yeasty, bready, baked good quality comes through. And they're really almost holding an even keel at that point. So it's all these interesting elements and flavor profiles created by the yeast strain coupled with the malt bill. And this is very much a classic Belgian-style malt bill here. Very, very well done. Overall, this is just a home run of a beer for me for this style. I absolutely love it. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's review, and that is Brewery Vivant's Wizard Burial Ground, the bourbon barrel-aged Belgian-style quad that clocks in at 10% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's Belgian-style beer review. We have got Brewery Vivant's Wizard Burial Ground. This is a bourbon barrel-aged Belgian quad. 10% ABV on this one. Brewery Vivant is based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So, yet again, another brewer I've had a few beers from, all of which have been great, but this is certainly the most different angle that I've had from them. In terms of label art, this one's kind of cool. It's got what looks like almost a floating wizard head over a scene of what looks like, I don't know, people at a Stonehenge looking scene. I'm hoping that the camera can pick it up. Oh, I always try and get as close as I can, but it's several feet away. But nonetheless, trust me, it looks really neat. I like it. Wizard Burial Ground, neat name. So let's get this one cracked. And yet again, we're going to get it poured right into the old goblet here. Yep, as I expected on a quad, it's going to be a little darker in color. Now, that's the thing. In terms of Belgian doubles, Belgian triples, standard Belgian ale, Belgian quads, there are some kind of likenesses, but there's no hard and fast rule that says what type of grain has to be used. That's not what dictates the difference between, say, a double, a triple, a quad. A lot of that comes down to variances and what the brewer decides to label it, but it much more has so to do with the volume of grain and not the roast of the grain that goes into the beer bill. So, yeah, quads you do typically see darker, triples you do typically see lighter. You also see that typically in doubles as well. Typically, the lower, be it a single, a double, a triple, a quad on, all the way up down the line, they tend to increase in darkness, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It's really just a quantitative measure, and the brewery has a lot of license here, but what they want to term it, but it's got to do with the volume of malts going into it, hence the higher ABV as you keep tiering up. And just as a great example, if you look at Chimay, one of the most storied Belgian brewers of them all, if you look at their lineup of their ales that they have, you know, there's the blue label, the red label, not dissimilar to how Johnny Walker has color coding, but, you know, standard double, triple, quad, all the way up the line, same thing. It's got to do, and that's the same reason that the ABV is stepping up, because it's got more malt in the base beer as it's being made, which is going to bump up the ABV. It's not really a reference to color. It does typically happen that they add in some additional malts, and that's really comes down to the brewer preference. The more and more malts you add in, if you want to give more depth and don't have it tasting as boozy, adding in a deeper roasted malt like a nice amber or caramel malt is going to really combat that potential for that really boozy edge to shine through as you keep boosting up the ABV. That's one of the main reasons that I suspect most double, triple, quad IPAs do the same thing, because it can really start tasting very boozy. But when you add in these more caramel, the more roasty notes, it does impart a big amount of flavor into it that can kind of help subdue that booziness that would otherwise bleed over into the beer. And you know me, I'm never going to shy away from a beer that tastes boozy. You know, I don't know if you've ever had it. This is an Austrian beer, Urbach 23. That's a big beer. Sammy Klaus, I also believe that might be Austrian. There's a few others, and there's some that are even higher. We're talking 40, 50, 60, 70% ABV beers. They are a thing. I haven't had some of the crazier ones. I'm sure they're expensive, very small batch, hard to find, but you can find some of the others relatively regularly at a well-stocked bottle shop that brings in interesting imports. But that's kind of the trend. It doesn't necessarily have to do with color, even though you do see most common, a little darker with the higher, different varying degrees of double, triple, single, quad. But it really has to do far more with the fermentables in the ABV than it does the color and the type of malt they chose with which to brew. That out of the way, let's take a peek at this one. I would say overall, this is very much a dark caramel color. You could call it amber. I would call it caramel. I think it's a lot more caramel. It's got slight hints of red, but it's a much deeper, true kind of orangey rust color almost. That's a caramel color to me. It's a very lovely beer. It's got a nice little creamy pad still floating on top. Let's jump over the glass for a sniff. Oh, yeah. Okay. See, and in this case, this is where I think their choice probably went very well. Bourbon barrel aged. Bourbon is going to bring a lot of aroma and flavor to the table, most likely. It's also naturally got these vanilla undertones, these caramelly and butterscotch undertones to bourbon in and of itself. So using a little darker roast malt in there, it's just going to bind it to that bourbon, and it's going to help the malt bill pop and mix beautifully with that bourbon barrel back. So I'm expecting a really nice classic Belgian quad kind of to come through, but with the bourbon, like many barrel-aged beers, just being like this added bonus that you get in the beer. So without further ado, let's jump in and see what this one's about. Oh, wow. Oh, that's absolutely delicious. This is a big beer, make no mistake, but it's not oppressively beer. And when I say big in this sense, I'm really talking about layers of flavor. Layers of flavor in this are huge. The first thing that I got as I started swishing around the palate was I already started to detect some of that bourbon characteristic coming through in the beer. As soon as I swallowed, that came in full force. That was the first thing that came through. And this is very common in a barrel-aged beer. And bourbon's a nice pungent spirit with a lot of depth and its own intrinsic characteristics to it. But that being said, I was hit with multiple different and interesting flavor characteristics that popped in this beer. So it tiered for me bourbon, massive amounts of caramel and kind of butterscotchy, a little bit of both. Below that, it started to get into tons of layers of very deep, rich fruit. I'm talking raisins, I'm talking plums, I'm talking both fresh, ripe, the actual flesh of the fruit, as well as their dried varieties, which does tend to concentrate the flavor. There's a little underlying suggestion of fig, so it does share some common elements that you often get in a barley wine, but this is in a nice bourbon barrel aged Belgian quad style ale. And let me tell you, it's absolutely fantastic. The way they built this, what they chose for their malt bill, the type of bourbon barrel, how long they left it in there, all of their ratios, this for me is about as spot on as it gets if you're going to barrel age a Belgian quad. Absolutely delicious and just packed with flavor. And as it's been about 30, 45 seconds now, I'm starting to get some kind of vinous notes, some wine-like qualities and some grape-like elements coming in. And of course, grapes have a very distinctly different flavor than their dried counterparts, raisins, which I got a lot of. But yeah, there's a lot happening in this beer. This is packed with layers of flavor, and it's a big, big beer. Absolutely delicious. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel, pick out this flavor development a bit more, think on the finish. The body on this one is definitely a bit more robust than on the Anchorage, but yet again, it's exactly what I would expect to feel on a quad. 1.5% ABV doesn't sound like that much, but it is pretty statistically significant. And in terms of kind of the breadth of the body and how the mouthfeels go hand in hand as you step your way up from just a standard Belgian ale to a double, to a triple, to a quad. It definitely does increase. This is right on the fence between medium, heavy. And that's common for most quads. It's exactly what I expected. Even though they're higher ABVs and it sounds big, oh, a quad, doesn't mean that it's going to have, you know, an imperial oatmeal stout body of breadth to it. It just doesn't. It's a completely separate beer style. But this, yet again, is exactly what I expected. This is almost textbook for my money. Mouthfeel, similar story. Yes, there is resistance. There's a good bit of fermentables that went in to make this beer. It's 10% ABV after all, but it's not thick like a milkshake IPA. It's a different quality, and time in the saddle, exposure to different beer styles, you will come to know this over time. I've been fortunate to have enjoyed thousands upon thousands of different beers in my life, of hundreds and hundreds of different styles, and this is exactly what I expected from a Belgian quad, barrel-aged or otherwise. They nailed the body, they nailed the mouthfeel. This is textbook. In terms of how the finish develops on this one, Belgian beers and Belgian ales, obviously this is Belgian style. It's not a Belgian brewer, it's an American brewer, both were, but it's in the spirit of a Belgian style ale. The finish is one of those categories that you never really know what you're going to get. Some are incredibly long, some are very truncated, some are just smack in the middle average. This, for me, is a little bit longer than average, but it's not as long as some. To be fair, I did personally expect it would be longer than average, just due to the barrel aging, and indeed that is the main driving impetus for the extension and beyond the norm of the finish on the back of this. It's that bourbon. The bourbon does linger. I would say it's longer than average, so it's clearly above average range, but it's not like crazy upper echelon like some will go. It's very nice. This is a very well-balanced, very well-rounded beer, and for my money, an excellent example of a Belgian-style quad, and then we get the added bonus of the bourbon barrel. I'm going to take my time, sip on this one, count my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with Anchorage Brewing Company's The Turning Shape. This was the Belgian triple of the bunch, Belgian style, of course. 8.5% ABV. Anchorage Brewing is based in Anchorage, Alaska. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this was very bold, very pungent indeed, and it really smelled exactly as I expected for any Belgian style beer. There was a nice underlying maltiness to it. There was some kind of spicy and clovey-like notes that came through, and it came through in abundance. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the taste was fantastic, honestly. This was one of those that if you didn't have the beers unmarked, if they were all poured in glasses in a line, in a lineup full of Belgian style triples or actual Belgian triples, and this was the only American interpretation of the style, I guarantee I would not be able to tell you that this was made by an American craft brewer and that it wasn't brewed in Belgium. I mean, they absolutely nailed it in every respect. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the body was nice and big and bold as you expect from a Belgian triple. They are higher ABV beers, and indeed they do have breadth to them. And I'm not suggesting that they're as heavy as, say, a milkshake double IPA would be, but it felt exactly right for the style, and they do have a nice bit of breadth. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the mouthfeel, same story here. It felt exactly right. It felt like the style should. It has a natural bit of resistance, a little bit of viscosity, but it's not what you'd call a syrupy beer, but it felt exactly right for the style. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish I was a little surprised on this one. It was very bold, it was very pungent, both in terms of aroma and intensity of flavor. However, I didn't get a super long finish on this one. There was a little bit of residual maltiness and a little bit of that slight clovey bite. It was on the high end of average, but it wasn't top tier. It gets a 6 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did a pretty solid job for poured at home. This is one of those styles, there's a lot of styles like this where you don't really know what you're going to get. Again, I think if you got this off of a proper tap at a bar, the head would have formed even better and held around a bit longer, but poured at home, it was well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the appearance, this was exactly what I expected for a Belgian style triple. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional. All of the right flavors in the right quantities. It had the exact vibe of an actual Belgian brewed, Belgian triple ale, but, you know, an American craft interpretation of it. And they nailed pretty much every bit of this beer for my money. Just a few little nitpicks in a few categories. But in terms of the balance of flavor, it was spot on the money. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible, subjectively, I loved it. This is exactly what I look for in a Belgian triple or Belgian style triple ale. Wonderful, 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, overall this beer did exceptionally well. The finish wasn't quite as long as I expected, and the head and retention wasn't perfect, but it was well above average. Overall, though, this beer was just exceptionally well done, and I think it does deserve top marks as an example. It gets a 10 out of 10, which brings the total score on Anchorage Brewing Company's The Turning Shape to a 94 out of 100. Well above average. This is top tier beer here. If you're a fan of the style, this is one to try to get your hands on. Moving to beer number 2, this is Brewery Vivant's Wizard Burial Ground, the Belgian style quad of the bunch. Bourbon barrel aged at that 10% ABV on this one. Brewery Vivant is based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. So starting with the aroma. The aroma on this beer was nice. It smelled nice. It smelled fine. It smelled like a barrel aged Belgian style quad, but the aroma wasn't super duper present. And even the bourbon, yes, I could detect it, but I expected it to have a lot more forward aroma come through. And really nothing about the aroma on this was high end in terms of pungency and how strongly the flavors came to the nose. But I said it was high end of average. It gets a 6 out of 10. For the taste on this was fantastic. It truly, truly was. This tasted just like a classic Belgian style quad should, but the added bonus of the bourbon barrel. And for me, barrel aging beers, sometimes the barrel can be too weak, it can be too strong. It struck a wonderful balance of all the flavors. So I got all of the classic, expected and anticipated Belgian style quad flavors come through in the profile, as well as the bourbon, and they all had their own voice. Gets a 10 out of 10 from me. For the body on this one was equally as impressive as on the first beer. It was a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, as it should be. It's a quad. Nailed it, 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel, same story here. It had the right amount of resistance. It felt exactly as I expected when moving it around the palate. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the finish on this one was noticeably longer than on the first beer, and indeed, the bourbon barrel really played the lion's share of extending out the end of the finish. It was above average, but again, wasn't quite as long as I anticipated. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one poured nearly identically to how the first beer poured, and it was well above average. Again, I think if you got this off a tap at a bar, it would be even better, but did a great job poured at home. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the appearance on this one, I was a little surprised. It was a little more caramelly, a little lighter in hue than I anticipated for a Belgian style quad, though it was certainly in the range of the color norm for the style. A little lighter than you typically see, but still in range. I only docked 1 point here. It gets a 9 out of 10. For the balance on this beer was exceptional. As I talked about in the taste, all of the expected flavors came through, including the bourbon, but they all had their own voice. That's exactly how to balance a beer, especially if you're going to barrel age. It gets a 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible, I loved it. It's not often you get a barrel-aged Belgian-style triple, double, quad. There's not a ton of them out there, but it really is a special, special treat. The style in and of itself is fantastic. You get the barrel aging and done right, and it's just kind of one of those next level transcendent kind of beer drinking experiences. I loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Okay, so I did nitpick a few categories. The aroma could have been a little bigger. The finish could have been a little bit longer. The appearance, okay, I was really nitpicking there, but I had to call it as I saw it. Head and retention was very good, but it wasn't top tier. So it did lose some points. But overall, the points that it did lose coming up to this final categorization really in the grand scheme of things didn't impact the beer drinking experience for me. And for how well crafted this was and what it was, I think it does deserve top points here as an example of the style. And I gave it a 10 out of 10. which brings the total score on Brewery Vivant's Wizard Burial Ground to a 90 out of 100. So both of these are absolutely top tier Belgian-style ales. One barrel-aged, one a quad, one non-barrel-aged, one a triple. Both distinctly different, but both brewed absolutely in the spirit of the Belgian brewers themselves. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.